Let's jump right into this explainer, shall we? We are taking a trip back in time, way back, to peel away the myth and look at the actual historical reality of Babylon. I mean, we're talking about a metropolis that completely dominated the ancient world. If you've ever heard the legends and kind of wondered what the reality looked like on the ground, well, you are in exactly the right place.
So what did the greatest city of antiquity actually look like? We hear about Babylon all the time in stories, right? But the physical scale, the sheer engineering prowess of this place, it was incredibly real and honestly, absolutely mind-blowing. Let's start by looking at where exactly this absolute powerhouse was built.
Which brings us to Section 1, the heart of Mesopotamia.
Okay, so location is everything, especially back then. And Babylon, they hit the absolute geographical jackpot. It was perfectly nestled right between two mighty rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, sitting right on the dividing line between Chaldea and Mesopotamia. Because of this, it was just destined to become this massive hub of wealth and commerce. Think of it as this vibrant green oasis of absolute prosperity right in the middle of a pretty harsh landscape.
And those ancient builders, they didn't just plop the city down next to the river. No, they actually integrated it. The Euphrates River ran directly down the middle, literally splitting Babylon into two perfectly mirrored western and eastern halves. It completely set the stage for the city's grand architectural layout. That layout leads us perfectly into Section 2, the invincible city walls.
480. That massive number is the staggering circumference of the city walls in ancient strates. We are talking miles upon miles of fortified, impenetrable brickwork. It wasn't just a wall, you know. It was this sprawling, incredibly thick defensive perimeter that honestly made the city look like a fortress built for giants.
And punctuating that massive perimeter were exactly 100 colossal gates. But get this, these weren't made of heavy wood or something. The ancient records tell us these 100 gates were forged entirely out of solid brass. Just imagine the sun reflecting off 100 massive brass doors as you approach the city limits. It was the ultimate statement. Absolute security on one hand and unimaginable wealth on the other.
Speaking of wealth, let's head inside for Section 3, the Golden Temple of Belus.
So the Temple of Belus was built on this massive square base that measured 2 stades in length, and it totally dominated the Babylon skyline. It was a towering ziggurat, basically a giant stepped pyramid, that looked like a man-made mountain literally trying to pierce the heavens.
And it was an absolute engineering marvel. It consisted of 8 distinct towers, stacked one right on top of the other. Winding around the outside of those 8 massive tiers was this continuous exterior staircase. Worshippers and priests would have to make this incredibly long, exhausting climb up the stairs just to reach the absolute pinnacle of the structure.
And what was at the top? Well, at the very summit of those 8 tiers sat a highly exclusive, deeply mysterious sanctuary. And what's super fascinating here is that, unlike pretty much every other typical temple of the time, this summit room held no statues. None. Instead, inside rested a magnificently crafted bed and a golden table. The priest claimed this specific room was prepared exclusively for the deity to rest in, and that the god only visited in the dead of night. But if you went down into the lower temple, the wealth was very, very visible. Down there sat a gigantic, seated statue of the god Belus, right alongside another massive golden table. The statue alone weighed a mind-bending 800 talents of pure gold. To put that into perspective, that translates to tens of thousands of pounds of solid gold. Just a staggering display of economic power and devotion.
All that wealth flowed directly from the top, which brings us to Section 4, the magnificent royal palaces.
The monarchy in Babylon didn't just settle for one palace. No way. They had 2 heavily fortified royal palaces anchoring opposite sides of the river, acting almost like keys to the city. The Western Palace was an absolute behemoth, a 60-stade perimeter enclosed by 3 separate layers of walls. The Eastern Palace, on the other hand, was a bit smaller at a 30-stade perimeter, but it was incredibly ornate, packed with intricate bronze statues of past royalty and deity.
Inside these palaces, the inner brick walls weren't just functional defensive structures, they were massive canvases. They were absolutely covered in masterfully crafted, vibrantly colored murals. These artworks depicted rulers like Ninus and Semiramis engaged in these really lifelike, heroic hunting scenes, spearing leopards and lions. It was essentially a constant, towering visual reminder to everyone of the king's bravery and sheer dominance over nature itself.
Now, to make sure the king could safely travel between these two colossal palaces, they built a massive bridge right over the Euphrates. But here's the crazy part. In a massive feat of ancient engineering, they actually temporarily diverted the entire river so they could build a waterproof vaulted tunnel right beneath the riverbed. It was 15 feet wide, 12 feet high, and historical sources claim the whole thing was constructed in just 7 days before they let the river flow back over it. 7 days, that's just wild.
Let's move to perhaps their most famous achievement. Section 5, the legendary Hanging Gardens. Legend actually has it that this marvel was built by the king specifically to cure his queen's homesickness for the lush green hills of her homeland. Structurally, it was essentially a square amphitheater of greenery. Think of a terraced pyramid, supported by massive columns, where each lush level rose 16 feet above the last. It was literally an artificial mountain of flora right in the middle of a flat, arid landscape. And those hollowed-out columns? They brilliantly allowed natural light to filter down into the royal rooms situated right beneath the gardens.
But think about this for a second. How on earth do you put a damp, heavily watered forest on top of a brick building without the water just completely destroying the foundation? Well, to keep moisture from ruining the palace below, they utilized this brilliant step-by-step waterproofing technology. First, they laid down reeds dipped in bitumen, followed by layers of baked brick, and then heavy lead sheets. Only after all that did they pack on a thick layer of earth, deep enough to support the roots of massive trees. It was genuinely centuries ahead of its time.
And to keep this artificial mountain green under that scorching Mesopotamian sun, they needed massive amounts of water. So the Babylonians hid ingenious mechanical water pumps inside those structural columns. These machines were constantly pulling water all the way up from the Euphrates River right to the summit, allowing it to just cascade down and water the terraces below.
But, of course, nothing lasts forever. Section 6, a city returned to dust.
We've just talked about the golden statues, the brass gates, walls 100 feet high, and just unparalleled wealth. But the golden age of Babylon, much like all empires, wasn't meant to last forever. Today, the reality is starkly different. The area near the modern city of Hilla consists mostly of massive mounds of dirt and rubble. Over time, the rivers shifted, the palaces were stripped for building materials by later empires, and the greatest city of antiquity was left completely stripped of its former glory.
This utter desolation actually perfectly mirrors the ancient prophecy of the biblical figure Isaiah. He noted that this Lady of Kingdoms, with all her immense pride and golden idols, would eventually become a desolate wasteland, a place where no humans would even pitch a tent, leaving it only for wild, doleful beasts and owls to inhabit. And honestly, looking at the ruins today, that description is incredibly accurate.
Which brings us to the end of our journey, leaving us with a pretty haunting final thought to ponder. How does a civilization capable of diverting mighty rivers, building waterproof sky gardens, and forging 100 gates of solid brass just vanish into the sand? It's a profound reminder of the impermanence of even the most incredibly powerful human empires. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and I really hope it sparked your curiosity to go out and learn even more about the wonders of the ancient world.
Welcome to the Explainer. Today, we're taking a massive journey back in time. We're going to explore the sheer scale, the absolutely mind-blowing architectural mastery, and the stunning rediscovery of the ancient Assyrian Empire. We're pulling all this straight from some deeply fascinating historical texts on Babylon and Assyria, and we've distilled those accounts to give you the ultimate grand tour today. Let's dive in. Think about it. What actually happens when an empire covering 100,000 square miles just vanishes? It seems completely impossible to us today, right? But an empire that literally dominated the ancient world was just swallowed up by the sands of time. For centuries, it was nothing more than a mystery, waiting to be dug out of the dirt. It's this wild story of ultimate power, catastrophic collapse, and finally, an incredible rediscovery. So here's our itinerary for the tour. First, we'll map out the vast Assyrian geography. Then we'll check out Nineveh's massive city walls, witness the fiery fall of Nineveh, explore Khorsabad and its famous winged bulls, and finally, dig into the treasures of ancient Nimrud. All right, starting off with Section 1, the vast Assyrian geography. This empire was basically a massive natural fortress. Spanning across what is modern-day Kurdistan, this incredibly fertile landscape was boxed in by the towering Noana Mountains of Greater Armenia up north and the Kingdom of Susiana down south. To the west, you had the mighty Tigris River. And actually, the whole territory was crisscrossed and fed by 4 major rivers: the Tigris, the Euphrates, the Zabis, and the Gorgas. And the sheer size of this domain, it is absolutely crucial to understanding their power. At its absolute peak, this sprawling powerhouse covered well over 100,000 square miles of land, just an absolute behemoth of the ancient Middle East. Moving right along to Section 2, Nineveh's massive city walls. So to protect the undisputed jewel of this empire, which was the capital city of Nineveh, sitting right there on the east bank of the Tigris, the Assyrians built walls on a scale that honestly defies belief. The perimeter of Nineveh's defensive walls measured a mind-boggling 480 stadia. And just to put that into perspective for a second, a single stadium was roughly 600 feet. Do the math and you'll see that is a massive perimeter. But they didn't just stretch far into the horizon. They towered over the entire landscape. We're talking walls rising a staggering 100 feet straight up into the air. It created this incredibly intimidating, sheer cliff face made entirely of baked brick and stone. And it gets crazier. Imagine a wall so thick, so incredibly sturdy, that 3 horse-drawn chariots could actually race across the top of it, side by side, at the exact same time. It wasn't just a defensive wall, it was literally an elevated military highway. And securing that massive perimeter, 1,500 individual watchtowers. Every single one of these towers soared 200 feet high, so double the height of the main walls. To anyone looking up from the outside, this fortress must have seemed entirely 100% invincible. Which brings us to Section 3, the fall of Nineveh. Well, as is often the case in history, unprecedented wealth eventually led to a whole lot of luxury and complacency among the city's elite. Seeing an opportunity, old rivalries started flaring up. King Cyaxares of the Medes and King Nabopolassar of Babylon decided to unite their forces. Sometime around 606 or maybe 625 BC, this alliance laid siege to Nineveh. They managed to breach those supposedly invincible walls we just talked about and brought fire and sword to what was then the greatest metropolis on earth. In a seriously dramatic final act, rather than let himself be captured, the Assyrian king Sardanapalus threw himself, along with all his wealth, right into the flames of his own burning palace. The destruction was just absolute. The city became a smoldering ruin. And over the centuries, Nineveh literally turned into desolate mounds of dirt, completely wiped from human memory. Think about that for a second. For generations upon generations, historians didn't even know exactly where this legendary, massive city actually was. Now for Section 4, Hursabad and the famous winged bulls. Centuries later, European explorers finally showed up to start digging into these really mysterious mounds. Fast forward to the 19th century, a French explorer named Émile Bata starts digging and absolutely strikes historical gold in the city of Khorsabad. Hidden right beneath the earth, he found the magnificent palace of King Sargon. This whole structure was built on a massive elevated platform, 200 meters on each side, and guarding its grand gates, these colossal statues of winged bulls with human heads, just spectacular stone guardians. Inside, Bata found vast rooms stuffed with weapons, incredibly intricate wall reliefs showing battles and hunts, and these gorgeous grand courtyards. Right next to Sargon's palace stood this unbelievable astronomical observatory. It was shaped like a massive 7-tiered ziggurat, reaching high up into the sky. If you're picturing something like the legendary towers of Babylon, you've pretty much hit the nail on the head. But what makes this structure truly fascinating is the level of detail. According to the texts, each of those 7 levels was dedicated to a specific celestial body and painted a brilliant, distinct color. So the first tier, for Saturn, was black, Venus was white, Jupiter was orange, Mercury blue, Mars red, the moon was silver, and that top tier, dedicated to the sun, was a brilliant, shining gold. It was literally a glowing, towering beacon of ancient science and religion. And finally, Section 5, the treasures of ancient Nimrud. The discovery of Khorsabad basically triggered a domino effect in archaeology. Following Bata's finds in the 1840s, Austin Henry Layard began excavating the ancient city of Kala, which we know today as Nimrud, in 1845. He ended up uncovering the breathtaking palaces of Ashurnasirpal III and Shalmaneser III. And then, by 1854, William Loftus was out there continuing the work. They were quite literally peeling back time, slicing through centuries of dirt to reveal the very core of the Assyrian Empire. The sheer volume of what they actually found is staggering. The excavations at Nimrud yielded these towering statues of gods, kings, and wild animals. They found highly detailed wall reliefs that basically served as ancient documentaries of their battles and ceremonies. But perhaps most importantly, they discovered the legendary clay tablet library of Ashurbanipal. Guys, this single discovery essentially gave us back the written history, the laws, and the daily life of a world that had been completely and utterly lost. A real game changer. As one historian noted, without the ruins of Nimrud, we'd stand completely bewildered by their architectural genius. And that really captures why this history matters so much. Without these physical, unburied ruins right in front of us, the incredible precision, the art, and the staggering engineering of the Assyrians, we would have just dismissed it today as a myth or a massive exaggeration. Seeing really is believing, and these stones force us to believe in their greatness. Which brings us to a final thought for this explainer. As we look at these excavated winged bulls and we read about 100-foot walls that were swallowed by dirt and completely forgotten for thousands of years, we have to ask ourselves, when our sprawling cities inevitably fall to the sands of time, what grand monuments of our own civilization will future explorers unearth? Thanks for joining me on this explainer. Keep learning, and I'll see you next time.
All right, welcome back, everyone. Today, we are diving into a massive, myth-busting tour of two of the absolute most legendary empires to ever exist, Babylon and Assyria. We're going to be tearing down the rumors, digging through the ancient rubble, and finally figuring out what's fact and what is just pure fiction. So, let's get right into it. So, looking at this, you've got to wonder, right? Is the greatest city in human history just a bunch of myths? We all know the wild stories, massive towers piercing the clouds, lush hanging gardens floating in the middle of the desert. But how much of this impossible scale was actually real, and how much of it was just really, really good ancient propaganda? Let's find out.
Okay, let's kick things off with part 1, the mystery of their origins and those very first inhabitants.
The history of Babylon's roots is literally the ultimate ancient drama. It's like a giant puzzle. On one hand, you've got Herodotus, the Greek historian, recording the mainstream outsider accounts, but then you have Berosus, a local Babylonian priest who actually, well, scratch that, he completely rejected the mainstream. He claimed the first inhabitants were entirely uncivilized until this mythical, half-man, half-fish being named ONS supposedly emerged from the sea to teach them literature, science, and city building. No way, right? But that's what they believed.
Moving right along to part 2, Nimrod and the founding of an empire. Way before Babylon became the center of the universe, there was Nimrod. This guy was the ultimate ancient conqueror. Widely known as the first great builder after the flood, he actually founded the foundational cities of Erech, Akkad, and Calneh. Local lore even claims he was the king who threw the prophet Abraham into a fiery furnace. These early cities established the kingdom's deep roots. And you really can't talk about this without mentioning the later great King Hammurabi. Hammurabi didn't just sit on a throne, he totally transformed the region. He dug these massive, complex canal systems that completely revolutionized their agriculture, built formidable defensive walls, and basically turned Babylon into an unparalleled, thriving capital. A real game changer.
All right, on to part 3, the wonders of Babylon, specifically the walls and gardens. Look at this number. Over 56 million francs. And no, that is not the GDP of a small modern country. That represents the equivalent weight in gold of just one single statue of the god Jupiter sitting right inside the Grand Temple of Babylon. The wealth pouring into this city was so immense, so over the top, that historians describe Babylon as literally being paved in gold. And they spent that wealth in crazy ways. So imagine trying to cure your partner's homesickness. Most of us might buy flowers, right? Well, to cure his Persian concubine who missed her lush green mountains, the king engineered the literal hanging gardens. They built these massive layered stone terraces on a flat desert, covered them in thick sheets of lead to stop water from rotting the structure, and used hidden, highly complex machinery to pump water directly up from the Euphrates River. It was basically a mountain of vegetation suspended in thin air.
But honestly, Queen Semiramis might have outdone the whole lot of them. She builds 2 colossal palaces on opposite sides of the Euphrates. But instead of just taking a boat across like a normal person, she ordered the river to be temporarily diverted and built a brick tunnel directly beneath the riverbed. It was coated in melted bitumen to make it completely waterproof. And according to ancient sources, they completed this underwater marvel in just 7 days. 7 days! That's insane!
Now, obviously, with all that impossible wealth lying around, you need some serious protection. Enter the inner walls of Babylon. 85 cubits. To put that into perspective, that is a staggering, almost unbelievable height for a defensive wall. And get this, they were about 90 cubits thick. Try to imagine being an invading army, walking up, and just looking at a sheer brick cliff face that massive, equipped with giant bronze gates and hundreds of guard towers. It was specifically designed to make enemies feel absolutely helpless.
Which brings us to part 4, the Tower of Babel. The ultimate question, is it myth or is it reality?
Take a look at this. These are the ruins of the Borsippa Tower, standing just outside Babylon. Many historians actually believe this vitrified step pyramid was the real-life inspiration for the Tower of Babel story. We even have these ancient clay cylinders from Nebuchadnezzar where he straight up brags about restoring this exact tower. He claims earlier kings failed to finish it because the people were scattered. Sound familiar?
And here's where it gets really fascinating. The Babylonians actually mapped the cosmos right onto the tower itself. As you can see, it had 7 distinct layers, and each one was dedicated to a celestial body and painted a very specific color. So it went from black for Saturn at the bottom, moving up through planets like Jupiter and Mars, all the way up to a brilliant, shiny golden top layer dedicated to the sun. It wasn't just a tower, it was a massive astrological observatory, really showcasing their incredibly advanced understanding of the universe.
Let's pivot a bit for part 5, the rise and fall of glorious Nineveh. You know, Assyria was an absolute military juggernaut, but history shows us that all empires eventually fall. When a massive coalition finally breached the walls of Nineveh, the Assyrian king Sardanapalus realized it was totally over. But instead of surrendering, he retreated to his spectacular palace, gathered up his immense wealth and his entire court, and just set the whole building ablaze. He literally chose to be consumed by the flames of his own empire rather than hand it over to his enemies. Talk about a dramatic exit.
And well, Babylon eventually met a very similar doom. Just think back to that 56 million franc gold statue we talked about earlier, and contrast that extreme, unfathomable wealth with this grim ancient prophecy from the book of Isaiah. It predicted that this glorious kingdom would literally turn to dust, inhabited only by wild beasts and owls. And that's exactly what happened. Over the centuries, the rivers shifted, those mighty 85-cubit walls crumbled, and the greatest city on earth became nothing more than a mound of dirt.
So, I want to leave you with a bit of a provocative thought today. We build our massive skyscrapers out of glass and steel, and honestly, we feel pretty invincible. But when you look at the ruins of Babylon and Nineveh, empires that literally ruled the known world, you really have to ask yourself, in 4,000 years, will our greatest modern cities be anything more than myths, legends, and dust in the wind? It really makes you think. Thanks for hanging out with me for this explainer, guys. Keep questioning everything, and I'll see you next time.
Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're throwing on our historical detective hats and heading straight back to ancient Mesopotamia. We're going to separate the grandiose, completely larger-than-life myths of the early Assyrian Empire from the actual, astonishing archaeological reality. It's a wild story of lost cities, ancient propaganda, and the incredible rediscovery of a civilization that literally vanished under the sand.
You see, ancient Mesopotamia was home to empires of such a massive scale that, long after they fell into ruin, they completely broke the brains of the ancient historians who found them. Greek historians, writing centuries after the fact, looked at the remnants of these colossal structures and spun these wild, epic tales. They honestly just couldn't believe ordinary humans built them.
And the absolute most famous of these ancient tales surround the legendary Queen Semiramis. According to Greek historians like Diodorus, she practically built the ancient world with her bare hands. The accounts claim she engineered the grandest wonders of Babylon, like this massive bridge over the Euphrates River with stone piers bound by actual molten lead. The legends grew so incredibly wild that they claim she raised massive armies and even ordered her craftsmen to stitch together thousands of oxides to create a literal army of fake elephants for a grand invasion of India. I mean, it's a completely bizarre, fascinating story of engineering genius and military deception.
Section 1. The Legend of Semiramis. Myth versus Fact.
So for centuries, much of the Western world totally bought into the Greek version of history. They really believed she constructed the legendary impenetrable walls of Babylon and transformed it into a golden city. But as modern historians finally began to unearth the region, a pretty glaring question popped up. Does the physical evidence actually back up this magnificent legend?
Well, when you compare the dramatic myths written by Greek historians like Ctesias and Diodorus to the actual cuneiform records carved right into the stone, a very different reality emerges. The Greeks placed her at the very dawn of time, right after a great flood, basically giving her an almost godlike status. But the hard evidence pulled from the Mesopotamian dirt tells a much more grounded, but honestly equally fascinating story.
Modern archaeological discoveries revealed a completely different timeline. Turns out the legendary Semiramis was actually based on a real queen named Samarmat. But she didn't live at the dawn of time. She lived centuries later, in the 9th century BC, as the wife of the Assyrian king Vulish III, also known as Shalmaneser. Also, while she was absolutely a prominent historical figure, the foundations of the First Assyrian Empire were laid by much earlier kings. And the true builders of those legendary walls of Babylon? Not her. It was much later kings, specifically Nebuchadnezzar, who painstakingly stamped his own name into the very bricks used to build them.
Section 2. Nineveh, the great capital.
Now, Babylon definitely gets all the mythological glory and the legendary tales, but the true heart of early Assyrian military and political power was actually further north. It was the sprawling, heavily fortified capital city of Nineveh. To really wrap our heads around the immense scale of Nineveh, we have to look at the numbers. Ancient accounts record that the defensive walls protecting the heart of this city stood a staggering 100 feet tall. Just think about the sheer engineering required to build walls that high using baked and sun-dried clay bricks.
And these weren't just bare, flat walls either. These incredibly high fortifications were guarded by an astonishing 1,500 defensive towers. It was literally a fortress designed to project absolute power and totally intimidate any rival empire that even thought about approaching its gates. Picture this, a wall so ridiculously thick and structurally sound that 3 horse-drawn chariots could race side by side right along its summit. Now, according to the legends, it was originally built by the mythical King Ninus, but the historical records show that generation after generation of real Assyrian kings continually expanded and fortified Nineveh until it was quite literally the most feared city in the world.
Section 3. Unearthing the truth. So, if Nineveh was seemingly invincible, how did it just disappear? And how did we finally figure out what was Greek fiction and what was Assyrian fact? Well, in 606 BC, Nineveh fell. A coalition of Medes and Babylonians laid siege to the city, breached its walls, and completely destroyed it, leaving it as just a desolate mound. For over 2 millennia, its true history was literally buried in the dust. Fast forward to the 10th century AD, a traveler named Benjamin of Tudela actually noted the massive ruins. But the real breakthrough didn't happen until the mid-19th century, when French consul Paul Emaboda and English archaeologist Austin Henry Layard started doing massive excavations at sites like Khorsabad and Nimrud.
Those grueling, dust-choked excavations shifted our understanding entirely. Researchers started digging through mountains of debris, and it moved us past the hazy myths of the Greek historians and right into hard physical evidence. They literally dug an empire out of the ground.
Section 4. Unearthing the royal palaces.
And what they found buried beneath those massive mounds proved that the historical reality was just as breathtaking as the myths. They uncovered majestic palaces belonging to kings like Sargon and Sennacherib. At the gates of these palaces stood giant winged bulls with human heads, these colossal stone guardians. The interior walls were lined with intricate stone reliefs depicting royal hunts, massive battles, and sieges. But perhaps most importantly, they discovered the vast cuneiform library of King Assurbanipal. This library held thousands of clay tablets, which finally gave the Assyrians their own voice back to tell their own history.
These real Assyrian kings left incredibly powerful inscriptions on these palace walls. King Sennacherib, for example, wrote this dedication fiercely demanding that future generations remember his magnificent creations, and he even warned of severe divine punishment for anyone who let his palace fall to ruin. He wanted his reality, his actual achievements, to outlast the ages, not just become some fable.
Which brings us to our final thought. The story of the First Assyrian Empire leaves us with a pretty profound question. When a magnificent civilization with 100-foot walls and unparalleled palaces just falls to dust, how quickly does its reality fade? How long before its true history is entirely replaced by larger-than-life legends of mythical queens and completely impossible feats? It is a powerful reminder that history is fragile, and the truth often requires us to dig deep, literally, to find it. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and I will see you in the next one.
Welcome to This Explainer.
Today, we're jumping straight back into the absolute unmatched scale and, frankly, the terrifying might of ancient Mesopotamia. We're talking about an era defined by unyielding power and the incredibly dramatic, literally fiery endings of its two greatest capitals, the Second Assyrian Empire and the Second Babylonian Empire. These were massive civilizations that truly believed their walls were going to touch the heavens and last forever.
But before we look at their golden ages, consider this chilling ancient prophecy about our second capital. It reads, "Babylon, a wasteland for wild beasts. Ostriches, owls, and jackals will dwell in their palaces." I mean, just think about that for a second. The seemingly impenetrable city of gold, literally the absolute center of human wealth, reduced to a desolate lair for scavengers. So how on earth does a superpower fall that far and that fast? Let's find out.
Part 1. Nineveh's Golden Assyrian Age, the zenith of power.
So Nineveh absolutely eclipsed all other cities of its day. Under the rule of infamous kings like Sennacherib and later Ashurbanipal, it transformed from just a restricted town into this massive, sprawling urban center that supposedly shone like the sun. It became the epicenter of an empire totally unmatched in wealth and absolute terrifying military authority. We're talking about tribute flowing in from literally every corner of the known world.
And with all that wealth came staggering arrogance. When Sennacherib built his glorious palace, he actually inscribed a curse to protect it. He wrote, "Woe to whoever discards this command. May Ashur and Ishtar strip his scepter and break his weapons." He was literally calling down the wrath of the gods to smash anyone who dared to alter his legacy. These Assyrian kings didn't just rule. They fully believed their power was divine and completely untouchable.
Part 2. The Fiery Fall of Nineveh, From Palaces to Ashes.
The reality of Nineveh's ultimate fate is pretty jarring. On one hand, you had a city of deep luxury and indulgence where the elite gave themselves over entirely to a life of ease. And on the other hand, well, absolute ruin. The historical texts describe a devastation so thorough, so complete, that centuries later entire passing armies wouldn't even realize they were marching right over the dust of what was once the greatest city on earth.
So how exactly did it happen? Well, first, a massive alliance of Medes and Chaldeans subjected Nineveh to a brutal, suffocating siege. Second, when those massive walls finally gave way, the desperate Assyrian king realized all was totally lost. But rather than surrender, he made a staggering choice. Step 3. He gathered his enormous wealth, his family, and his courtiers into his palace, built a massive pyre, and burned himself and his entire court to ashes. A genuinely terrifying, fiery end to Assyrian dominance.
Part 3. Nebuchadnezzar's Golden Babylon, the architectural marvel.
Okay, I want you to just think about this number for a second. 120. Ancient historians like Herodotus documented the outer walls of Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon, and they consistently use this exact number to describe the length of just one side of his great fortress. But 120 what, right?
120 stades. A stade is an ancient unit of length. And when you do the math, 120 stades on each side equals roughly 513 square kilometers of enclosed city space. That is just a mind-boggling size for the ancient world. The sheer scale of Nebuchadnezzar's city was designed specifically to project absolute invincibility. It was built to overwhelm anyone who even looked at it.
And the sheer scale doesn't stop there. Here's another massive figure pulled directly from the historical records. 383,300. That is the number of square cubits of space enclosed by just one of the city's inner defensive walls, known as the Nemedi Bel. So Babylon wasn't just a city. It was a sprawling, multi-layered fortress made of baked brick and bronze. Inside those massive walls was pure architectural genius. The Great Tower of Borsippa, which Nebuchadnezzar beautifully restored, was a breathtaking seven-tiered ziggurat. And notice how each tier actually represented a celestial body painted in very specific colors. You had black for Saturn, white for Venus, purple for Jupiter, blue for Mercury, red for Mars, silver for the Moon, and gold for the Sun. It was literally an attempt to pull the cosmos down to Earth and cement Babylon as the absolute center of the universe.
As you might guess, Nebuchadnezzar was incredibly proud of this whole shebang. On the foundational cylinders, he left this boast: "I completed its magnificence, the sanctuary of the majesty of the great god Marduk." I think this perfectly captures the unyielding pride of Babylon right before its historical collapse. They truly thought they had engineered a city that time and enemies could never, ever touch.
Part 4. Cyrus and the Sudden End, the Breached Riverbed.
But Babylon had a fatal flaw in its design. You have these impenetrable 100 stadia stone and brick walls that absolutely no army could smash through. But the Euphrates River flowed directly under those walls and right through the center of the city. The Persian conqueror Cyrus realized a terrifyingly simple truth. You really don't need to break a wall if you can just walk right beneath it.
Here is the shocking sequence of events. Step 1. Cyrus arrives outside the impregnable walls. Inside, the Babylonians are completely unbothered. They're actually celebrating a massive Chaldean festival, totally drunk on their own perceived safety. Step 2. While they party, Cyrus's engineers upstream divert the mighty Euphrates River into massive trenches. Step 3. The riverbed is exposed, and Cyrus's army silently wades right into the city, directly under the water gates. Just like that, Babylon, the greatest fortress on earth, fell in a single night without even a massive battle.
And so they became a legacy of dust and memory. Despite all the terrifying curses of Sennacherib, and despite Nebuchadnezzar's 120-state walls and his 7-tiered towers of gold and silver, these vast empires eventually became nothing more than just hills of dirt. For centuries, people walked right over these mounds, completely unaware that underneath lay the remnants of the absolute greatest powers the ancient world had ever seen.
Which leaves us with this incredibly provocative question to ponder. When the golden cities fall, what truly remains of ultimate power? Is it the massive walls we build, or is it just the stories that somehow manage to survive the ashes? Thank you so much for exploring the unmatched scale and the dramatic falls of these ancient empires with me today. Keep learning, keep questioning, and I'll catch you next time.